Around 8 p.m. on November 3rd, 2013, 45-year-old Will Walker taped up a cardboard box in the master bedroom of his home in Cleveland, Ohio. He labeled it with a Sharpie and then stacked it with a bunch of other moving boxes in the corner that he had also made up. Will was in the middle of moving his family out of their current place in the city to a bigger house in the suburbs. And even though it did sort of seem like an upgrade, he had mixed feelings about it, in part because he'd invested a lot in this community in the city. He'd raised kids here with his first wife, and he also worked here as a lieutenant firefighter. But Will knew it was time for a big life change, because his beloved new wife, Yuloma Curry Walker, had recently been diagnosed with cancer. And realistically, she actually didn't have very long left to live, and so Will wanted her to spend the time that she had left in a neighborhood that was more comfortable and more quiet than this one. As Will began to pack one of those moving boxes he had made, he felt his stomach growl. He was hungry. So before getting into really heavy packing, he stopped and he headed down the hallway to the living room, where he found his wife laying on the couch wrapped in a blanket. And she was clearly on the phone with her 17-year-old daughter, Jackie. So Will and Yuloma both had previously been married, and they both had kids from their previous marriages. But most of them were adults, and they had moved out and they were living their own lives. Except for Jackie, the girl that was on the phone with Yuloma right now. She actually still lived with Yuloma and Will. But this evening, she was across town at her boyfriend's place, but for the time being, she was just chatting with her mom on the phone. As Will approached the couch, Yuloma looked up at him and she waved and she smiled. And as she continued chatting with Jackie on the phone, she began coughing. Just a small, dry cough, but immediately Will was on edge because anytime he heard his wife coughing or just acting like she was sick, he worried that this was the start of the end. Is this her dying? He was just so worried about her. But luckily the coughing passed and she just kept on chatting away with Jackie. And so Will, he walked up to her and he sort of gently interrupted her and just said, "Hey, you want me to run out and grab us both some dinner? I'm pretty hungry." Yuloma, she nodded and she smiled and she covered up the phone and said, "Yeah, I'd love to get some McDonald's." And then she just went back to her call with Jackie. And then Will, he bent down and he kissed her on the top of the head. He grabbed his keys and he headed out the door. McDonald's sounded great. A half an hour later, at 8:30 p.m., Will pulled back into his driveway and parked in front of the garage. He cut the engine, and then he grabbed the McDonald's bag off the passenger seat. As he stepped out of the car, though, he paused and intentionally looked back out toward the street, just to make sure the coast was clear. So Will had lived on this block for decades, and it had always been sort of a rough neighborhood. But lately, it just seemed to be getting a whole lot worse. Less than a month ago, Will had actually gotten into this really heated argument with a guy right here in his driveway. And it had been so heated that Will had actually brandished a gun to get the guy to leave. Will was still very much on edge about that, sort of worried this man would come back to, exact his revenge or something. And in some ways, this was another reason why he felt like maybe it really was time to move out of here and get to the suburbs. But for now, looking out to the road and the sort of surrounding areas, he didn't see anything or anyone that concerned him. So he closed his car door and with his McDonald's bag in hand, he crossed the driveway towards the back door of the house. However, when he slipped his key into the lock on the door, he heard footsteps coming up behind him. And as Will turned, there was a deafening bang. Inside the house at the same time, Yuloma heard the sound of what sounded like 4 gunshots echoing from outside. Instinctively, she leapt off the couch and ran over to the window, still clutching her blanket tight around her. And when she looked outside, she saw her husband's car in the driveway, but she didn't see her husband, or anyone for that matter. Nobody was outside. Then she heard the sound of someone moaning in pain, and it was like instinctively she immediately knew it had to be Will. And so she ran to the back door, she's frantic, she opens it up, and there he was. 30 minutes later, around 9 p.m., Detective Tom Lynch of the Cleveland Police Department stood outside of Will and Yuloma's back door, staring down at a pool of blood on the ground. Behind him, an officer was cordoning off what was now a crime scene, while detectives and forensic specialists searched the area for evidence. Lynch had reached the scene only about 10 minutes ago, but already he had pieced together some basic facts. Will Walker, the victim, was a 45-year-old lieutenant firefighter, and he had been shot 4 times in his own driveway. His wife, Yuloma, had found him bleeding out by the back door and immediately called 911, and Will had been rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. He was obviously very badly hurt, but apparently he was still alive. Now, Lynch knew that because Will Walker, the victim, was a respected member of the community, he was a longtime firefighter, that very likely there would be increased pressure on Lynch and his team to figure out who did this. But in a neighborhood as rough as this one, Lynch knew that was not going to be an easy task. Now, as Lynch studied the outside of the crime scene, his gaze traveled from the pool of blood where Will had been found, to the bag of fast food lying a few feet away, and then up to the keys that were still dangling from the lock on the door. It looked like Will had been ambushed while walking from his car to the house. It was a very short distance, which meant the shooter would have only had maybe a few seconds to make their move. Lynch heard someone call his name from behind him, and he turned around to see another detective just a few feet away, pointing to something in the grass. And so Lynch walked over and then crouched down and saw that what they were pointing to was a 9mm shell casing. Then the detective pointed out another shell casing, and then another, and another. And they all led in a straight line toward the back corner of the garage. Not inside the garage, but like the back exterior of the garage. And so Lynch, he followed the line of shell casings towards that corner, and he found there was this small gap between the back of the garage and the back fence. In this area, there were no lights. It was very well shielded from the street. Like if you were back here, nobody could see you, really. And so this was like a perfect hiding spot for the shooter. As Lynch took in all this new information, he tried to visualize what might have happened here. He pictured the shooter waiting right here behind the garage, not coming from the street, but over here waiting, and then Will comes into the driveway, he gets out of his car, he makes his way towards the door, at which point the shooter comes out and starts shooting. It was an ambush, which suggested that, especially based on the location of these shell casings, like this was truly somebody waiting for Will. This was not like a botched robbery. This was not random. This was someone who likely knew Will was going to be back soon, and they waited for him, and then they shot him. And so at this point, Lynch felt pretty confident that this was a premeditated murder, or at least attempted murder, because at that point, it was believed that Will was still alive at the hospital. And if he was still alive, Lynch hoped he'd be able to identify the shooter. 2 hours later, around 11:30 p.m., Lynch followed a nurse down a hospital corridor. Will Walker was still in surgery, so in the meantime, Lynch was going to speak with Will's wife, Yuloma. The nurse led Lynch into a private waiting room for family members, and right away, Lynch saw Yuloma sitting alone in one of the chairs. She was wearing a big coat and a scarf, but she kept rubbing her hands together and shivering like she was cold. Lynch nodded to the nurse to let her know that he could take it from here, and so she left to give them some privacy. Then Lynch went over to introduce himself to Yuloma. He sat down and he took out his notepad, and then he gently explained that he was leading the investigation into Will's shooting, and he needed to know everything she could remember about that night. Yuloma, who was still clearly very cold and shivering, she nodded, and in a weak voice, she explained that just before the gunshots, she'd been home alone. Will had been out getting them dinner, and her daughter Jackie was over at her boyfriend's place. Then at 8:30 p.m., she said she heard those 4 loud bangs. She'd run outside and found her husband bleeding out in the driveway, and so she called 911. Lynch nodded as he jotted down everything she was saying, but nothing she was saying was particularly revelatory. I mean, her story matched up with what he had seen at the crime scene and what first responders had told him about what they saw. So now Lynch flipped his notepad over, and he asked the question that in some ways mattered the most in terms of what Yuloma could offer him. Did her husband have any enemies? However, before Yuloma could answer, there was a knock at the door, and a second later, a pair of doctors came inside. And from their expressions, Lynch knew it was not good news. Instinctively, Lynch stood up and stepped out of the way as one of these doctors came over to Yuloma, and they took her hand and told her that her husband, Will Walker, was dead. Around 9 a.m. the next morning, November 4th, Detective Tom Lynch stood in the rec room of a Cleveland fire station speaking to 3 firefighters who were co-workers of Will Walker, who had been shot to death the night before. Lynch's conversation with Will's wife, Yuloma, the night before in the hospital had understandably been cut short when she received the news of her husband's death. So now Lynch was trying to get information from anyone else who was close to Will before he ultimately went back and asked Yuloma that question about, did her husband have any enemies? And so for now, he was here at the fire station to find out if maybe any of Will's coworkers knew about any conflicts Will had with anybody. But so far, from speaking with the guys who worked with Will, it sounded like he was like the most popular guy at the station. Everybody liked him. These firefighters kept telling Lynch what a hero Will was, and how Lynch needed to solve this case quickly because Will and his family, they deserve justice. The community deserved justice. So Lynch was naturally feeling a lot of pressure to deliver here. But he was actually kind of optimistic for two reasons. First, because DNA had been recovered from the shell casing from Will's driveway. Now, the DNA didn't match anyone in law enforcement databases, but this was still a really strong development because Lynch knew he'd be able to test any suspects against that DNA from the shells. And the second reason he was optimistic is because once he was finished here at the fire station, Lynch actually was heading to an interview with Yuloma. She'd had a little time to process the news, and now apparently she was ready to speak to him again. A half hour later, Lynch was sitting across from Yuloma inside of an interview room at the Cleveland police station. She looked absolutely exhausted, and by now, Lynch knew that it was not just from having been up all night, very likely, dealing with the grief of losing her husband, but also because, according to Will's coworkers, Yuloma had cancer. And in fact, it was her terminal cancer diagnosis that had ultimately pushed Will to marry her after 8 years together. Prior to the diagnosis, Will and Yuloma had sort of taken their time in terms of how they would define their relationship, because they'd both been married before, and they didn't want to rush into anything, because obviously their previous marriages didn't go well. But when Yuloma got really sick, and it was clear she didn't have much time left, they decided, enough waiting, let's just get married. And so now, Lynch picked up with Yuloma where they had left off the night before. He asked her again, did Will have any enemies? And after spending the entire morning listening to Will's coworkers talk about what a good man Will was, Lynch expected Yuloma to say no. But instead, Yuloma nodded and said yes, he did. But she also quickly said that it was definitely true that the vast majority of people loved Will, her included. Like, he was a great guy. He was very popular at work, and he was beloved in the neighborhood. And he was very close with his kids and stepkids, and he was even on good terms with his ex-wife Rita. But Yuloma said she could think of at least two men Will definitely had not gotten along with. Yuloma explained that the first man she suspected was actually her own ex-husband, Macklin Hines. Yuloma described Macklin as an ex-convict with an explosive temper. She said Macklin had always been very possessive towards her, even after they had gotten a divorce, and that possessiveness had only intensified after she had recently married Will just 4 months ago. Yuloma said she didn't know if Macklin was jealous enough to have committed murder here, but she knew he was definitely capable of violence, and she said that she had not heard from Macklin in several days. The second person that Yuloma said Will had issues with was actually a man from the neighborhood named Eugene Cray. According to Yuloma, Eugene was friends with their next-door neighbor, and whenever Eugene came by to pick up his friend, the neighbor, he would sit out in his car smoking weed, blasting music, and blocking Yuloma and Will's driveway. And Yuloma said this had really bothered Will. And a few weeks before the murder, he'd finally lost his patience. One afternoon, when Eugene had shown up again with his car, blocking the driveway, blasting his music, smoking his weed, Will had pulled out his handgun and stormed out of the house to confront him. Now, Yuloma said she hadn't seen what happened next, but she heard shouting and then the sound of Eugene speeding away, and when Will came back inside, clearly amped up from this confrontation, he just told Yuloma that he had handled it and Eugene would not be back. And so at this point, Lynch stopped for a second and just thought about what he had been told. In terms of this Eugene story, it sounded like Will had really lost his temper. And if he had maybe embarrassed or threatened Eugene, that was the kind of thing that could turn into a grudge that could lead to murder. And so at this point, to Lynch, Eugene was sounding like a really, really good suspect, especially since his recent argument with Will had actually taken place in the same area where Will was ultimately killed. 3 days later, on November 7th, around 6 p.m., Detective Lynch walked through a big candlelight vigil on Yuloma and Will Street. A massive crowd, hundreds of neighbors, firefighters, and police officers had come out to honor Will. Lynch scanned the crowd, and he eventually found Will's family, and they were clearly speaking with reporters. Will's two adult children were standing there beside this woman who Lynch guessed was Will's ex-wife, Rita Walker, and then a few feet away from them was Yuloma, looking very frail as she leaned on her teenage daughter, Jackie. And for Lynch, I mean, seeing this vigil and seeing, Will's bereaved family just standing there in the middle of all this just sadness, it was heart-wrenching. And in part because he knew that despite his early optimism, the investigation into Will's killer was really not going particularly well, at least not so far. For the past couple of days, Lynch and his team have been trying to contact Eugene by phone and at his home, but he seemed to have just vanished. And to make matters worse, Lynch's other main suspect, Yuloma's ex-husband, Macklin Hines, hadn't panned out. It turned out there was actually an extremely good reason why nobody had heard from him for days around the time of the shooting. It was because Hines had actually been in jail on the night of Will's murder. Like, he literally couldn't have done this. Now, of course, it was still possible that he could have hired someone to do it, but as for now, it seemed like Macklin was not as good of a suspect as they once thought. And now, as Lynch stood there at this vigil amongst so many mourners, he knew that if his investigation didn't start delivering answers soon, a lot of people were going to be very disappointed. And to get those answers, Lynch knew they needed to find Eugene Cray. More than a month later, Detective Lynch was back inside of the police station's interview room, sitting across from a skinny, scowling man. This was Eugene Cray, and he'd walked into the station earlier that morning, demanding to know why the police were leaving flyers with this photo all over his block. And Lynch had actually been kind of amused that Eugene was acting so indignant, because for more than a month, police had been doing everything they possibly could just to contact this guy. They'd knocked on Eugene's door, they left messages, asked Eugene's neighbors for help, but there had not been one single peep out of Eugene that entire time. Almost like he didn't want to be found. But the flyers seemed to have flushed Eugene out, and now Lynch sat across from him, waiting for him to explain why he'd apparently been in hiding since the night of Will's death. But Eugene just folded his arms and said he didn't have anything to do with the shooting. He said he'd been at home in bed that night listening to music with his headphones on. So he said he hadn't even heard the gunshots, and he lived in the same rough area, so he would have, but he didn't, because he was in bed with headphones on. Now, Lynch thought this was a very poor alibi because, Eugene didn't have anybody who could confirm that he had been at home, in bed, headphones on at the time of the murder. It was just his word against everybody else's. And so instead of trying to, dig into the alibi, Lynch just asked Eugene about that confrontation he had had with Will a few weeks before the shooting. And Eugene told him pretty much the same story that Yuloma had. That he had been outside, he'd been sitting in his car, according to him, he was minding his own business, when Will suddenly appeared, storming out of his house, waving a gun in the air, yelling for Eugene to turn down his music. And Eugene said, just from the look on Will's face, he seemed mad enough that he might actually use the gun. So Eugene said he just sped off as fast as he could. Lynch studied Eugene as he was saying this, and there was just something about this guy's demeanor that it seemed unlikely that Eugene would have let their conflict end right there. That, Will came out, he yelled at Eugene, and Eugene drove off, and that was it. Like, the idea that Eugene was just gonna go on with life and not be upset with Will, it just seems sort of far-fetched. And so he really wanted Eugene's DNA. That way he could just test it against the showcasing DNA and find out the truth. But Lynch knew that Eugene had a history of prior arrests and seemed to know his way around a police interview, so Lynch guessed that if he pressed for a DNA swab right now, Eugene would refuse and very likely lawyer up. But Lynch at the same time felt like he really did need this swab, like he had to ask. So, doing his best to not seem too eager, Lynch leaned back in his chair and, as casually as possible, asked if Eugene would submit a DNA sample, just so they could rule him out as a suspect. And to Lynch's surprise, Eugene just shrugged and said, okay. About 3 months after the murder, in February of 2014, Detective Lynch sat at his desk reading through a thick stack of financial documents. Now, by this point, the Will Walker murder investigation had pretty much stalled out because Eugene Cray's DNA did not match the DNA on the shell casings found at the scene. Still, Lynch had pressed on and questioned everyone he could think of: Will's neighbors, his coworkers, his kids, his stepkids, and even their romantic partners. Lynch's team had also poured through hours upon hours of security camera footage collected from the homes and businesses that were near Will's house. But even after all that effort, Lynch was nowhere closer to solving this case. So now, with really no other ideas, Lynch was just going through all of Will's financial records that he could get his hands on: bank statements, loan documents, mortgages. And Lynch's eyes were starting to glaze over when a stray form suddenly caught his eye. It was an addendum to a $100,000 life insurance policy for Will. According to this form, to this addendum, in the event that Will died, that money would not go to Yuloma or his kids or his immediate family. It would go to his ex-wife, Rita Walker, who he hadn't been married to for 9 years. The following afternoon, in February of 2014, Detective Tom Lynch led Rita Walker into an interview room at the Cleveland police station. And Rita seemed very confused about why she was being questioned again, 3 months after her ex-husband, Fire Lieutenant Will Walker, had been murdered. So immediately after the killing, Rita, along with Yuloma and all the kids and stepkids, they had all been interviewed pretty much right away. And at the time, Lynch hadn't even considered Rita a suspect. So this time, when Lynch sat down with her, the questions were different, because now there appeared to be a clear motive for Rita to want to harm Will. So he began by asking Rita where she was on the night of the murder. And right away, Rita's expression sort of tightened. She paused and then said that she couldn't really remember all the details, but she said that she had stopped by Will and Yuloma's house around 1 p.m. to pick up her son, who had spent that morning helping Will and Yuloma pack. And this information sort of caught Lynch off guard. I mean, he knew that, Will was shot at night, and Rita is describing being at Will's house in the afternoon, so hours before the shooting. But here she was, admitting that she was there on the day of the murder. She was at the scene of the crime. So Detective Lynch moved on to the real reason he had asked her to come down. And he asked about that life insurance policy that listed her, rather than Yuloma or anybody else in the family, as the beneficiary. And Rita, she sat back for a second and just stared at Lynch. And then she nodded and said, of course she knew about that, because that was how it was meant to be. She explained to Lynch that Will had taken out that policy as a safety net for his kids, and he had named Rita as the beneficiary because he trusted her to divide the money between their kids. And to Lynch, he had to admit this did sort of make sense, but he also had a different theory. He suspected that Will had just never gotten around to updating the form, but with his recent marriage to Yuloma, it was probably on his to-do list. And if Rita had figured that out, it might have pushed her to have Will killed before he could remove her from his own policy. But that was really just a hunch that he kept to himself, and Lynch also knew he really didn't have the evidence to charge Rita with anything here. And after almost half an hour of questioning, Rita was still very confidently sticking to her story. So eventually Lynch told her that she was free to go. Then Lynch, he got up and he walked Rita out to the front of the building. But as he watched Rita get into her car and pull out of the parking lot, his eyes narrowed because he suddenly realized he recognized Rita's car from somewhere. Lynch's mind immediately began to race as he ran back to his office and turned on his computer. And once the computer was on, he pulled up the security footage from Will's neighborhood. And after scrubbing through a dozen files, he found what he was looking for. A security camera had captured footage of Rita's car just a few blocks away from Will's house right before he was killed. This was clearly not that afternoon visit that Rita had already told Lynch about. This was a second visit to Will's neighborhood that she had not mentioned at all. Less than half an hour later, Rita was back inside the interview room, and Lynch was staring her down as she frantically tried to explain herself. Now that Lynch had confronted her with this footage, Rita had totally changed her story, admitting that she had actually gone back to Will's house that night. but she said it was just to pick up some shoes her son had left there and that she'd left long before Will's murder. But what Rita really couldn't explain was, if this was so innocent, why hadn't she mentioned it before? And so now, Lynch just stared at her, letting his silence pressure her to keep on talking. He was hoping Rita would slip up or crack or confess, but as the interview went on, Rita just kept insisting again and again that this was an honest mistake, that second visit meant nothing, she was just getting shoes, and she didn't know why she didn't bring it up. And this was a problem for Lynch and the whole investigation, because even though the facts did look quite bad for Rita, she had a motive, she had been at the crime scene close to the time of the murder, and she'd failed to tell the police about being at the crime scene. But Lynch knew that he still didn't have enough to charge her with anything. And so Lynch sat there hoping that Rita would, offer up something that would allow him to charge her, like a confession or just anything. But she stuck to her story again and again. And eventually, once more, he had to let her walk out. 9 months later, in December of 2014, Detective Lynch was in his office when his phone rang. He answered, and the station receptionist said a man from Will Walker's neighborhood had just come into the precinct, claiming he had vital information about the murder. Apparently, this man was being escorted to an interview room, and Lynch could go question him when he was ready. Lynch said thank you and hung up the phone, but then he just sort of sighed and sat back and rubbed his forehead because he was not optimistic about this new lead. Because 1 month ago, the Cleveland Firefighters Union had announced a $24,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Will's killer. And ever since then, the station had been flooded with false tips. And so Lynch and his team, they'd spent weeks chasing down basically rumors that went nowhere, and it was really frustrating. So even though he figured that, whoever this guy was waiting for him in the interview room was very likely gonna go nowhere, it was gonna be another dead end, he still felt like, what, I got nothing else to do. I'll go see, what he knows. So he stood up, he left his office, he made his way down the hall, he walked into the interview room, and sure enough, there's this guy he didn't know who's sitting behind the table. And so Lynch, he sat down as well, and he just said, okay, what do you know about what happened to Will Walker? And this man, instead of saying anything in response to that question, just pulled out his phone, put it on the table, and hit play. And when Lynch realized what he was listening to, his eyes went wide, because the audio on this man's phone had just cracked the case wide open. Based on the evidence that was collected at the crime scene and on witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Will Walker on the night of November 3rd, 2013. At around 8:30 p.m., the killer, who was very nervous, was hiding in the shadows behind Will Walker's garage. They were doing their best to try to calm themselves down, to be ready for what they were about to do, but they knew it was going to be very risky for them. Just then, the killer heard a car pulling into the driveway. And as the engine cut off, the killer leaned out of their hiding spot and saw Will Walker step out of his car with a fast food bag in one hand and his keys in the other. The killer took a deep breath at this point because they knew this was it. And as Will began walking across the driveway toward the back door, the killer drew their gun, rushed out of their hiding spot, and began shooting. And they ran as they shot. And as Will fell to the ground, a flash of red in the air told the killer that they had hit him. So without stopping to check for a pulse, to make sure Will was actually dead, the killer turned and ran to the fence, climbed over it, and jumped down into the alley behind the house where the getaway car was waiting. The killer leapt into the back seat right as the driver began peeling out of the alleyway, and as they're speeding along, the person sitting in the front passenger seat turned around and asked the killer, "Is Will dead?" And when the killer, who was, still laying in the back seat, composing themselves, they nodded and said, yes, he was. The person in the passenger seat just turned back around, pulled out their phone, typed a text, and then hit send. That text message confirming the shooting went straight to the person who had actually orchestrated this hit on Will Walker. And when the text came through to the architect's phone, that person was actually standing over Will as he bled out. The architect was also the same person who called 911 and who would cradle Will as he lay there dying. because the mastermind of this murder was Will Walker's beloved, cancer-stricken wife, Yuloma Curry Walker. Except Yuloma was not at all what she seemed, starting with the fact that she didn't actually have cancer. From the very beginning, Yuloma's cancer diagnosis had been a big, elaborate lie. Police believe she fabricated the illness just to convince Will to finally marry her, because that way she could, 1, be put on his health insurance policy, and 2, if he were to die, she could collect on his life insurance policy. But Yuloma didn't realize that Will's life insurance policy was still in Rita's name. But despite that oversight, it did not stop Yuloma from putting a tremendous amount of planning into the plot to murder Will. In fact, if you remember that phone call that Yuloma was having with her daughter Jackie, that when Will walked in the living room, there was Yuloma, she's on the phone, and he asked her if she wanted dinner, and she's like, yeah, go to McDonald's. Well, that phone call with Jackie is the one that actually sealed his fate. Because the instant Will left the house to go get their dinner, Yuloma, who's still on the phone with Jackie, told her daughter that, hey, he just left. And Jackie, who knew the plan, she passed that message along to her boyfriend, Chad Paget, who was sitting in a car right down the street from Will's house, waiting for this message. And he was there along with his getaway car driver and the man he had hired to actually carry out the shooting. The shooter was Ryan Doherty, a young man from the neighborhood who had agreed to kill Will for $800 and some marijuana. And the getaway car driver was actually just a friend of Chad's who thought they were there to buy drugs. Yuloma had promised to pay Jackie and Chad for finding people to kill her husband for her, but Chad was very sloppy, and one of the people he offered the job to was later caught on tape talking about it. And that recording is how the investigators came to learn that Chad, Jackie, and Yuloma were all involved. And at first, they really couldn't believe it, because Yuloma's performance as a cancer-stricken, dying widow had been so masterful, no one had looked close enough to see who she really was. Yuloma Curry Walker was arrested on September 8, 2015, and she was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for her role in the murder plot. As for the people she convinced to participate in this plot, they were convicted on a range of charges and spent between 2 years and life in prison. And then as for Rita Walker, Will's ex-wife, she was not involved in the murder in any way, so her story was absolutely true, and she would eventually receive that life insurance payout, just as Will had planned. In 2010, an avid caver named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. He arrived in country, he got a rental car, and he hired a guide to take him out to the area where he knew this cave was going to be. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook where he had taken notes the last time he was here, and he used that to find the opening to the cave. He paid the guide to stick around at the car while he went down and explored this cave. He assured him it was not going to be for a very long time. The shaft was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. The visibility inside of the shaft was limited because all you had was the light that was coming in, and because of how narrow the opening was, Jeff's body would obscure a lot of the sunlight coming in. So once Jeff got a few meters down into the tunnel, he would rely on his headlamp. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. So that's where the tunnel goes from being on an angle to being straight. And he's about to make that final descent down that final 30 meters when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. And he looks around him and he realizes from his position down on the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. As much as Jeff wanted to stop right there and go right back up to the surface, he couldn't. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear. And his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters to the bottom, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. Periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. He saw them on the rope, he's trying to brush them off. He finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up and he begins making his way back up. And the whole time he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off to get all the spiders off of his clothing. He takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there. After he finally brushes all the spiders off, he redresses and gets in the car. And you can only imagine what the guide was thinking as he's watching this guy, this foreigner, taking his clothes off after being in this cave. But luckily, he doesn't get bit. He gets in the car with the guide, and they start heading back towards the city. As they're driving, he takes his notebook out, and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. He scratches that out, and on top of it, he writes, "The Entrance to Hell." In 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. This was not a typical farm with animals and crops. It was a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and Evan and his family made their living baling pine straw every year. As such, their main living house on the farm was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined up pine trees. They did not have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one road that led into the property, which from the main house, they could look out and basically see through the rows of trees all the way to the beginning of this road, which meant any visitors were really easy to spot. The main house was built on a very slight hill, which meant one side of the house was effectively built on stilts to compensate for the angle. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. So anyone who was in the living room looking out the window, they basically need to look at a downward angle to see the ground. It would actually seem like you were on the second floor, but really you're on the first floor. The window in the living room was very unique. It stretched almost the entire length of the room, so almost 50 feet across. And at night, you could see animals darting between the different trees because you could see down the rows. And so that was pretty creepy. And then just the fact that this window is so big, if you're in the living room at night, you just felt really exposed. So between the creepy animals running around and the level of exposure and vulnerability, people basically avoided the living room anytime they were in the house at night. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with him on his farm, and because the main house did not have any extra bedrooms, Evan and his cousin would have to sleep in the living room. There were two couches inside of the living room, one that was right underneath the 50-foot long window, and then another which was on the other side of the room against a wall that did not have a window. And so Evan would be sleeping on the couch right under the window, and his cousin would be sleeping on the other couch. The first night Evan's cousin was there, they put this big sheet up over the window, but it only blocked like 75% of the window. The two flanks of the window were still exposed, but where the couches were lined up, they were kind of blocked by this sheet, so it gave them a little bit of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the boys finally fell asleep around midnight, and then they woke up a couple hours later because they heard Evan's dogs barking way off in the pine trees. Now, Evan was used to his dogs running around the property and barking at other smaller animals, and so just them barking was not necessarily a red flag. But the barking persisted to the point where Evan's cousin got up off the couch, moved across the room to the opening of the window that was not covered by the sheet at the foot of where Evan was sleeping. Now, Evan was still laying on the couch. He was not going to get up and look out the window, so he's looking down at his cousin, kind of looking at his face to get some sort of a read on what he's seeing. And he notices his cousin has this really perplexed look on his face, like he's squinting his eyes and trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And so Evan looks at him and says, "Hey, what's going on? What do you see?" And his cousin's like, "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At this, Evan jumps off the couch and runs over and butts up right next to his cousin so he can look out the window too. And he's scanning out amongst the rows of trees because there's just a mile of pine trees. And the first thing he notices is the moon is very bright that night. So there's good illumination, and there was a light snow covering on the ground, which really added to the illumination. He's looking out maybe 100 meters when he sees someone's leg extend from behind one of the pine trees as if they're stepping into the space between a pine tree column. And he's staring at it, and he can't believe he's even seeing anyone walking around this area because he didn't see anybody come in on the road, and they have no neighbors. And so he's looking, and then a body follows the leg. A person walks from one row to the next. This tall, dark figure just walks calm as can be between the two pine trees. And Evan just grabs his cousin, and he's like, "Did you just see that?" And his cousin's like, Yeah, I saw that. And so they continue to look in the direction of where this person crossed the path. And after a couple of minutes, they see another leg now emerging, going the other way, back towards where that first person had come from. So the leg kind of extends into this gap, and then this tall figure walks across into the next row, except now, instead of going just directly across, it looks like they're moving at an angle closer to the main house property. The boys look at each other and they don't know what to do, so they just keep looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they're looking, they see this person emerge again, except now they're not 100 meters away, they're like 20 meters away. They don't know how they were able to move that quickly without being seen. And this time when the leg comes out from behind the pine tree, instead of walking across the gap, it stops right in the middle, and it turns and it looks directly at the boys in the window and then begins running toward them. The boys practically fall over trying to get away from the window. Evan's yelling for his father upstairs, and the boys instinctively just start running around the house, locking every door, shutting every window. And as they're going from door to door, the anxiety is growing and growing because they think, if I don't get there fast enough, this person who is running towards the property is going to come barging through that door. And so at every door, their anxiety is through the roof, but they manage to shut everything. Everything is locked right as Evan's father comes charging down the stairs. He's got his gun in hand and he's like, what's going on? And they say, there's someone out in our property. Their dad charges out the front door. The front door is not on the same wall as the living room. It's on the side of the house. So once he goes outside, he's going to need to turn to the right to look out in the direction they were describing. He bombs outside, he stays on the porch, and he starts yelling at whoever's out there that if you come over here, I'm going to shoot you, get the F away from here. And then there's silence. And the boys are waiting, they're looking around, they're checking the window. They don't see anything. The dad comes back inside, he shut and locks the door, and he tells Evan, keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know. Evan would reflect on this experience later on and say, you know, we really should have called 911 at that point. But as a kid, I just understood that that's the way my family did business. We kind of took care of ourselves. And so even though there is a threat of some stranger who's running at our property, we were not going to call the cops. And so his dad effectively was telling him to be a lookout. And so Evan and his cousin, they go back into the living room and they kind of go up to the window. They're a little bit apprehensive and they're looking out. And after 5-10 minutes of looking out the window and not seeing anything, they're thinking to themselves, you know, Evan's dad's a pretty intimidating guy, and he was just out there screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. So they probably got the message and they're probably gone. And so the boys got back into their couches, and it took them a while, but they did ultimately fall asleep. The next morning when the boys got up, the first thing they wanted to do was go out there and see if they could find footprints from this person to kind of confirm it really was a person, because part of them thought, you know, maybe we didn't see that. Maybe that was our imaginations. They don't know. And so they start by going out the front door, so not on the same wall as the living room. They go out the front door, they turn and they walk down into the trees, and they're looking around and they find some footprints. So they're confirming to themselves, okay, there was someone out here. It wasn't us. This is not our footprints. We found them. So they start following the footprints back towards the property, and they realize at some point there are two distinct sets of footprints. There were two people out here. And even worse is they followed them all the way up to the house. And there were two different circles of footprints that stopped right underneath the living room window along the two flanks of the window where the sheet was not covering. Which means over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were up at that window looking out, there's a good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up against the side of the house. And they would not have seen them because of the angle out of the living room window. It was steep because of the stilts it was on. And so anybody that was tucked up along the side, they'd be in a blind spot. And then for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into bed and were sleeping, there were two strangers who were right up against those windows, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father found these footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from, but unfortunately the snow cover wasn't complete, and at some point they lost the tracks and they never figured out who those two people were. Evan would say, following this event, his cousin refused to ever come back over his house for a sleepover. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated, there's lots of lights and cameras, so anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, you know, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside, and the crickets and the passing by of cars, when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you'd come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back, and now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound, and he's telling himself this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed, and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. And then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. And he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room, and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." He said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope." So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss. She goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there, and at some point his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was gonna die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that. but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird, and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, and so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment. And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't. And so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And then he scans and he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially, he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of this sleep paralysis, when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV, and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. And he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. And she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark. And he's left paralyzed, knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house. And it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor. And she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one step, two-step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance, stop this paralysis, wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge, and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up. except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before, now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled, she's half asleep, and she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down. And they're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago, but I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room and she stood on me, and it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays that way. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike, she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark, she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail. So it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person, because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut, because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks up the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent, she zips it up, and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest, and she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up, she is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn, she doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning, she jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were gonna finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. On June 7, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started started playing together. And that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone. And they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side at the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here, and that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking: how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this, this is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine, but I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, they're happy, and everybody moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at, and for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. And then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen, and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey, Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up, in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location, and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time, that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it, and when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him. And then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety, but he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go unanswered. In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music, they're jumping into the pool, then getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, 2 other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, They breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the three of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused two of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while the third, Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. On Saturday, September 30th, 2017, a staff member at a North Wales country club noticed water leaking out of the bottom of an outside wall of one of their many bungalows. These bungalows, which were generally just vacation rentals, were single-story white structures situated up on this beautiful green hillside. The staff member, after seeing this leak, they just turn around and go back to the front office and they tell their boss about it, and then shortly after, two maintenance workers were sent out to check on this leak. And so these two workers, they go over to this bungalow and they knock on the front door. But after a while, when no one comes to the door, they pull out their master key and they begin to turn the lock. And as they do that, they yell out just in case, hey, we're here just to check on a leak. We have to come in. It's a potential emergency. And so they open up the door, they swing it open, and no one comes to the door. It's still silent. And they're looking into this property. And what they see is on the left, from their perspective, is a kitchen. And on their right is a living room. It was basically one big room that had been designated for two distinct functions. And so they yelled out again into this bungalow, hey, we're coming inside. We're just checking on this leak. And then they just walked straight across past the living room and past the kitchen to the back of this property where they reached a door. And this door led into a bedroom, and this door was shut. And so just as a precaution, they knocked on the bedroom door, but nobody came to the door again. So they opened up the bedroom door and they looked into this room. And on the right side of the room, tucked up against the right wall, were two twin beds where the head of each bed was tucked up against the wall. And then in the middle of the room, at the base of these two beds, was a pile of unopened luggage. And so to the two maintenance workers, this told them that someone clearly was staying in this bungalow. Either they had just arrived or they were getting ready to leave, but apparently they were not there right now. And so the workers walked around the luggage and around the two beds. So they walked on the left side of the room all the way to the back where there was another closed door, and it went into the bathroom. And based on where the leak had been coming out of the structure, they believed it would be coming from this particular bathroom. And so again, they get up to this door and they knock on it because, they want to make sure no one's in there, but there's more silence. And so they open up the bathroom and right away they see water all over the bathroom floor. But as they scan around the bathroom, they look at the sink, they look at the shower, the toilet, none of them are overflowing or running. So it was not any of the usual suspects that had caused this leak. However, there was one other area in the bathroom that could have caused a water leak, and that was the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is typically where you keep a hot water heater. It's basically like a walk-in closet where the majority of the space is taken up by this heater. And also generally people put in shelves in front of the heater to store their linens and towels and that sort of thing. And in this bungalow, the airing cupboard had its own door, and it was right in the bathroom, and this door to the airing cupboard was right to the left of the door that led into the bathroom from the bedroom. And so these two workers, they reached over and they opened the door that led into this airing cupboard. And as soon as it swung in, they could tell right away where the leak was coming from. And they could tell right away they had a much, much bigger problem. 7 days earlier, 60-year-old former policewoman Mary Isherwood arrived at the North Wales Country Club. She and her ex-husband had for a long time owned one of these bungalows. However, they almost never stayed in it. They basically used it as an income property, renting it out to vacation goers. But they had recently decided that they wanted to actually sell the property. And so before the sale became final, Mary had told her ex-husband that she just wanted to go and spend a week actually enjoying the property and actually take a vacation there. And so originally, she and some friends were going to go to this bungalow and spend a week there. But right before they were going to leave, Mary's friends all said they couldn't make it. And so Mary decided she would just go on her own. And so Mary arrives at this country club. It's late at night when she gets there. She gets to the bungalow. She puts her luggage down in her bedroom. And then instead of just kind of getting settled in and going to sleep, she decides she's going to go exercise. Mary was incredibly fit and healthy. She loved playing golf and running and exercising in general. And she knew the club had a pool. And so she reached into her luggage and she just pulled out a bathing suit. She switched into that, and then she went down to the pool and did some lap swimming. After that, she came back to her room where she took a shower, and then she climbed in bed without any clothes on. That was just how Mary liked to sleep. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Mary woke up to go use the bathroom. And so she hopped out of her twin bed. She walked around to the door that led into the bathroom. She went inside, she did her business. And then afterwards, as she was attempting to go back into her bedroom, she accidentally grabbed the door handle of the airing cupboard, which was right to the left of the door leading back to her bedroom. She opened it up, it swung inward. She stepped into the airing cupboard, which was totally pitch black. And as she walked in, she might have bumped into the shelves or realized, this was the wrong turn. But as soon as this happened, the door behind her had actually shut. And so she's inside of this tiny airing cupboard, realizing, okay, this is not where I need to go. I've made a silly mistake. She turned around to grab the door handle to open the airing cupboard back up again. But when she grabbed the knob, it disintegrated in her hands. It broke into multiple parts and fell to the ground. Now, the space she is in is pitch black. She has no way of knowing which parts go where for this doorknob. And so by touch, she reached down and she grabbed all these pieces, and she probably tried to put them together and put it back on this door to try to get it open, but she just couldn't do it. And so eventually, Mary would have realized this is a pretty serious situation. She was staying at this bungalow by herself, and she was not expected to check out for another week. So no one was going to be checking on her. And without this doorknob, she could not open this closet door. It was a hard wooden door. The locking mechanism was solid. There was just no way to open it without this doorknob. And so Mary began banging on the door and screaming out for help. But her bungalow was not actually connected to any other structures. It was a standalone. And so her voice did not carry very far, and the banging sounds she was making, those also did not carry very far. And so no one heard her. And so after several hours, she's just standing in this closet, probably thinking to herself, how in the world did I get myself in this position? But after the initial shock of this totally bizarre situation she was in had worn off, she decided to act. And so she turned away from the door and she faced towards the back of this closet. She would have been face to face with a row of shelves, but she wouldn't have been able to see the shelves because it was totally dark. And then beyond the shelves, farther into this closet, was the actual hot water heater. There was no wall behind the shelves. Basically, there was a space behind the shelves where this heater was. And so Mary grabbed one of these shelves and she managed to break it off the wall. And then she turned around and used this piece of wood and tried to smash the door, but very quickly realized that was just going to do nothing. However, she began striking the wall right next to the door, and she realized she could break through the drywall. She was starting to kind of burrow a hole. And so maybe she thought to herself, if I can just build a hole big enough right next to the door, I can reach through the hole and maybe open this cupboard from the outside. And so she began using this shelf to smash this wall, and she's burrowing as fast as she can, but the progress must have been very, very slow because she decides she needs a different tool. So she turns back around, so she's facing the shelves again, and she breaks down a few more shelves to clear a path to get to the water heater. And then once she could step past the shelves, once there was a path, she got right in front of this water heater, and then by touch began feeling around for any pipes extending off of the heater. And when she found one, she got a good grip of it, and she began yanking and tugging on it until she managed to rip a piece of pipe off of the hot water heater. Now, as soon as she did that, she now had a pipe that was a far better tool for burrowing and creating this hole in the wall. However, as soon as that pipe broke off, cold water began leaking out of this hot water heater, the water that had not been heated yet, and it was being sprayed all over the inside of this cupboard. Now, this was a very small space, and so there was no way for Mary to get out from under this cold water, and so it was a shocking and probably very painful experience. But she now had her tool and figured, okay, this is awful, but I'll just use this tool, I'll burrow this hole, I'll get this cupboard open, and I'll get out of here. And so with the water raining down on her, Mary used her new piece of pipe and began digging and burrowing at that spot right next to the door. But after a while, probably several hours, she struck a brick wall. There was no way she could actually push through this wall and reach around and open the cupboard door. There was nothing she could do. It was a dead end. And so totally devastated and probably very exhausted from all the energy she used to burrow this hole, she stopped. She's still getting rained down on by all this freezing cold water. And instead of just totally giving up, she just turned and faced the wall that was leading into her bedroom. She began digging again, using this tool all over again to now dig a new hole on this other wall, most likely hoping that she could literally burrow a hole big enough that she could actually crawl through into her bedroom and escape. And so after several more hours of digging as fast and as hard as she could, while also periodically banging on the door and screaming out for help, she did eventually push through into her bedroom. However, in a cruel twist of fate, when she did finally poke through this wall, there was no bricks in the way, she hit what felt like another dead end. But in fact, what it was a picture frame with a glass cover across it had been screwed onto the wall in her bedroom. And this painting was right over where she was digging this hole. And so in her totally exhausted and panicked and saddened and scared state, she hits the back of this painting. And again, it's pitch black and she's feeling through the hole most likely, and she's touching this hard back of this painting. And she's realizing, oh my goodness, I've hit another dead end. There's nowhere for me to go. Even though in reality, she could have very easily just broken through that frame and then maybe made the hole a little bit bigger, and then she could have squeezed through it and escaped. But she didn't know that, and so she eventually just slouched to the ground and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body slumped up against the wall inside this closet. She had died of hypothermia. It would turn out other residents of the other bungalows nearby heard banging coming from this bungalow on Saturday night, the night that Mary actually got stuck. And then they also heard the banging the following morning, on Sunday morning. But none of the other residents reported it because they believed it was just construction or some other maintenance work. However, there was one couple staying in one of the nearby bungalows that thought there was something off about this banging, and they told each other, if the banging persists past 5 p.m. on Sunday, so that's the day after Mary got stuck, this couple told each other that if it continues past 5 p.m., we'll report it. But as it happened, Mary stopped banging on the walls and yelling for help right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. And so this couple, right as they're getting ready to go tell the front desk, the banging stopped, and so they stopped worrying about it. It's unclear how long Mary survived after she stopped banging around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, it could have been days. Mary's family would ultimately sue the country club for negligence. However, the outcomes of this case have not been made public. On July 30th, 2013, 56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall. He turned right and walked down the hall until he reached the trash chute, which was right on the side of the wall. He opened it up. It was like a mailbox. He opened it up. He dropped his trash bag inside. He closed the trash chute and then walked back to his apartment. When he got back inside, he instinctively reached down to his right pocket to grab his cell phone, but it wasn't there. So he grabbed his left pocket, wasn't there either. He checked his back pockets, he's fishing around, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. So he figures, okay, I must have put it down somewhere in my apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. But nonetheless, he began looking all over his apartment for his phone. He started in the kitchen, he looked all over the place, checked all the surfaces, no cell phone. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. And so he left his apartment, he turned right, and he walked along, retracing his footsteps all the way to the trash chute. But all along the way, there was no phone on the ground. And so as he's standing in front of the opening to this trash chute, he thinks to himself, maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. And so as Roger is standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, one of his neighbors walked out into the hall and looked down and saw Roger standing there kind of inquisitively looking at this opening to the trash chute. And they asked Roger, what's going on? And Roger explained the whole phone situation. And the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room on the first floor where all the trash goes. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He turned and made his way to the elevator, and the neighbor went back inside of his apartment. Roger went down to the first floor. He went to the manager's office. He knocked on the door. And when the door opened, the manager was obviously very busy with something. And Roger would say, hey, I'm just looking to get into the trash room. I think I might have accidentally thrown my phone away. And I just want to have a look in the trash to see if I can find it. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. It was a dangerous space. And so the manager was supposed to go in there with them if they needed to go in and look around in the trash. But right when Roger went up to the manager's office, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and so couldn't really leave his office. But the manager kind of empathized with Roger and felt bad for him and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. And when you're done, just bring the key back here. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He took the key, he left the office, and he made his way down the hall to the trash room. And when he got there, he unlocked the lock and went inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. She tried calling his cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so she walked around the apartment hoping there would be some indication of where he might have gone, like a letter or something, but there was nothing. And so Roger's wife was really concerned about this because this was totally out of character for her husband to go out at night on his own. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. And so a few minutes later, 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. They go up to Roger's apartment, they speak to Roger's wife, and then they go into the hall and they knock on some doors of other neighbors in the area. And after speaking with them, one of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone, and the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room to try to see if he could find his phone down there. And so the officers go down to the first floor, they go to the trash room, and they try the door, and it's unlocked. And when they open up the door and they look inside, right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room that basically looked like a basement, was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. And that was the bottom of the trash chute. So when people like Roger and the other people who lived in this apartment building dropped their trash down their respective trash chute on each floor, the trash would come tumbling down and literally fall out of the ceiling into the dumpster. Now, this dumpster was unique. It was not like other dumpsters where the top was just wide open and anyone could lob a bag of trash in. No, this dumpster, only the left side of the dumpster had an opening for trash. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. There was no way into it. And so on the left side, where this dumpster opened up to allow trash to come in, it was positioned right underneath that opening in the ceiling where the trash came tumbling down. And it wasn't just an opening. It was like this near vertical tunnel that was welded on to the top of this dumpster. And it went straight up and it had this big open mouth at the top, almost like a funnel. And it was there to catch the trash as it fell down, and it would go down this tunnel down into the dumpster. And so the gap between the ceiling and the top of this near vertical tunnel, this chute, was maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so when these officers looked into this room and they saw this dumpster and the chute and this hole in the ceiling, they also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster right up against that near vertical tunnel, as if someone was trying to look down into the dumpster itself. And so one of the officers walked over, they climbed up the ladder, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After a lengthy investigation, this is what is believed to have happened to him. After Roger got that key from the manager, he went to the trash room, he opened it up, and then he went inside and found this huge dumpster. And he would have quickly realized the only way to look into the dumpster, and so to go looking for his phone, was to look down into this tunnel. There was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up against the side of the dumpster, and he climbed up on top and he looked down into the tunnel, down into the dumpster, and as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow. But either way, he lost his balance and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. And what Roger didn't know is as soon as that happened, he was doomed. Because this was not some ordinary dumpster. This was a trash compactor. And as soon as Roger fell down that tunnel, his body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. And so the way this worked is there was this big metal ram inside the dumpster. There's a ram on one side, and once it gets activated, it will press. There's a hydraulic press that pushes it all the way to the other side. So any of the trash in this dumpster will get compressed against the other side of the dumpster. And then at that point, the ram comes all the way back. And so every time trash would come down that chute, it would trigger that sensor, the trash compactor would start, it would flatten the trash, and so on and so forth. And so Roger has fallen down into the dumpster, he's triggered this compactor, but he's legally blind, he's probably dazed from the fall, and so by the time he realizes what's going on and he's kind of looking around, there is a hydraulic press bearing down on him. And so he probably tried to jump up the tunnel to try to escape the dumpster, but there was no ladder inside this tunnel and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. And inside of the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and there was no emergency exit. And so at some point, it's assumed that Roger realized he was not going to be able to climb up the tunnel. And so he only had one direction he could go, which was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster, as far away from the press as he possibly could be. But once he got over there, there was nowhere for him to go. And so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. Now, we don't know if that very first hydraulic press actually killed Roger. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. And so by the time the police actually looked down into the dumpster, they saw a part of Roger's body, and immediately they could tell there was nothing they could do. Roger was definitely deceased. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case have not been made public.